Welcome, everyone. I'm Dov Waxman, the director of the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israel Studies and the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies at UCLA. Today's lecture is the first in a three-part series featuring distinguished Israeli scholars who will examine the past, present, and hopefully future of democracy in Israel. This lecture couldn't be more timely, as the insurrection of the US Capitol last week demonstrated so shockingly democracy, particularly liberal democracy, cannot be taken for granted. It is more vulnerable than we like to think. And in this historical moment, it is facing serious threats in many countries around the world as populism and illiberalism are gaining strength. Core principles and practices of liberal democracies, such as the free press, an independent judiciary, and the rights of minorities have come under sustained attack, and illiberal democracies have emerged in many places. Like every country in the world, Israel is not immune from this global trend. Israeli democracy has withstood many challenges over the course of the country's history, and today it also faces some serious challenges. Israelis are themselves well aware of this. In fact, in a recent survey conducted by the Israel Democracy Institute, 57% of Israelis said that Israeli democracy is in grave danger. Israel's president and many other public figures have also expressed their concerns about the threats to Israeli democracy. Against this backdrop of growing concern for the future of democracy in Israel, the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies is organizing this lecture series, as well as a research colloquium devoted to exploring the condition of democracy in Israel. We hope to stimulate new thinking and research about this crucially important topic, so that we can better understand how Israel's democracy came into being, how it has survived many challenges, its particular strengths and weaknesses, and its future prospects. To guide our learning, we have enlisted some of the most important scholars and thinkers from a range of disciplines. To introduce our first distinguished speaker, Professor Shlomo Avineri, I will now turn over to my colleague and the co-sponsor of this series, Professor David Myers, who holds the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History at UCLA. I'd like to thank David for organizing this series of programs with me. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Dov. I hope everyone is staying healthy and safe. On behalf of the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History, I'm delighted to join with the Nazarian Center in support of this important series devoted to exploring democracy and the democratic tradition in Israel, past, present, and future. It hardly bears emphasizing, as Dov has already stated, that democracy today is in a state of global crisis. We are less than a week past the armed insurrection at the Capitol building in Washington. While shocking, this event was not altogether surprising, given the sustained assault on democratic norms and institutions by Donald Trump over the past 4 years. But Mr. Trump is as much a symptom as a cause. He's part of a larger ecosystem that has grown in strength over the course of decades. This ecosystem is not confined to the United States, but extends around the world, from Turkey to Hungary to Britain, and indeed to Washington, D.C. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, one of the architects of this global movement, proudly describes its underlying ideology as illiberal democracy. This brings us to Israel. The last decade, the long decade of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's rule began in 2009. Netanyahu is a friend of Viktor Orban's and Donald Trump's, and has not hesitated to borrow from the illiberal democratic playbook in taking aim at his political enemies, attacking the judiciary, and enshrining Jewish national identity as the supreme ideal of the state, without any mention of democracy. At the same time, the fact that Israel will embark in March on its fourth election in 2 years suggests a healthy measure of dysfunction. How did we get to this state? Where does Israel's own crisis of democracy come from? Are the roots local, global? There are few more appropriate experts to answer these questions than Shlomo Avineri, who is one of Israel's most eminent scholars and thinkers. Born in Poland, Shlomo Avineri moved to Mandatory Palestine in 1939 at the age of 6, so you can do the math yourselves. He was educated at the Hebrew University and the London School of Economics, and has spent his entire academic career at the Hebrew University in the Department of Political Science and also as Dean of Social Sciences. He is an Israel Prize laureate, as well as winner of the prestigious Emet Prize, amongst many other awards. There are two features of Professor Avineri's career that merit attention for us today. First, he has consistently woven together the conceptual nuance and rigor of the philosopher with the careful attention to contextual detail of the historian. He has brought this mix of skills to bear in more than 15 books devoted to major figures in European, Jewish, and Zionist thought, such as Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Karl Marx, Moses Hess, and Theodor Herzl. Perhaps most known to members of this audience, his book, The Making of Modern Zionism, featuring profiles of key Zionist personalities, is a hallmark of lucidity that reveals the entwined threads of philosophical and historical analysis. The second feature of Professor Avineri's career that I'd like to call attention to is another kind of entwining. He is, on one hand, a man of the ivory tower, a master at providing nuanced interpretations to abstruse philosophical treatises. But he is also a person of the public square, committed to bringing the weight of critical analysis to bear on key contemporary issues. Perhaps most notably, Professor Avineri took a break from academia in 1975 to serve for 2 years as Director General of the Israeli Foreign Ministry. He assumed a number of other official capacities in governments led by the Labour Party, to which one must perhaps add the epitaph of blessed memory. From his formative years in Nazi-era Europe, to his distinguished career in Israeli academia and public service, to the current moment of great upheaval, Shlomo Avineri has seen, lived through, and studied grave challenges to democracy. It is therefore fitting and most fortunate that we have as a guide to the perplexity of our time, Professor Avineri, to discuss Israeli democracy, historical origins, future perspectives. One brief program note. Following Professor Avineri's lecture, we will have an opportunity for discussion. Please send along your questions by using the question and answer function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Without further ado, Professor Shlomo Avineri.
Thank you very much, Dov and David, for your generous introductions, and thank you for the invitation. When I received the invitation a few months ago, we never thought that this will be a week after a major crisis in American democracy. We may come to it later, but I want to focus on Israel. Imagine the following. Imagine a new state is being established. On the day of its establishment, it's going to be attacked by all of its continental neighbors. It will withstand this attack. It will be able to maintain its existence and territorial integrity, but it will lose 1% of its population in this war. In the next few years, this country will never really know for at least 30 or 40 years one day of real peace. And it will take decades until some of its neighbors will be reconciled to its legitimacy and existence. On top of that, from the very beginning, this country will grow by major immigration, mainly from poor countries, immigrants being either survivors of the Holocaust or people who fled neighboring countries, Arab countries, which where it was very difficult for them to continue to live with the emergence of the Israeli-Arab conflict. Now, this is obviously Israel. And one of the questions one would ask is, under those external and internal pressures, more than doubling its population within 3 years, a very poor country with no major resources, no oil at that time, no gas at that time, what would be the chances of this country maintaining a liberal democracy? Now, this is not just a question for Israel, because after or since 1945, since the end of World War II, almost 100 new countries emerged all over the world, in the Middle East, in Asia, in Africa, in the Caribbean, in Latin America. Most of them, practically all of them, on achieving independence, adopted liberal democratic constitutions based on free elections, a multi-party system, and a free press. In many cases modeled on either British or French systems, because those were the major imperial colonial powers which ruled those countries. Most of those countries, with some major exceptions, India is being obviously a major exception, most of those countries were not able to maintain the democratic structures. They became either one-party dictatorships or military authoritarian dictatorships, turned communist or semi-fascist, or combination of all the above. Israel maintained, despite serious flaws and serious challenges, its democratic system. It grew from a country of 650,000 people, most of them Jewish, to a country of 9 million people, 20% of whom are Israeli Arab citizens. And the question is, what is the reason for this difference? What made it possible for Israel, under internal and external pressures, which were much more difficult and much more harsher than any of the other new nations after World War II, to maintain a democracy? When you look at the textbooks, you will find basically two answers. And both of them have an element of truth in them, but both of them are insufficient. One answer, which in a way is obviously a little bit even absurd, is that there is a Jewish tradition of democracy. Well, this is obvious nonsense. When you look at the holy books of Judaism, the Bible, obviously the Davidic and Solomonic kingdoms were not democracies, nor could they be. The Hasmonean, Maccabean dynasties were Hellenistic tyrannies in one way or another. So there is nothing in the text, either in the Bible or in the Mishnah or the Talmud, that calls for liberal democracy, nor could it be, because liberal democracy, after all, is a modern post-18th, 19th century development. So it's not in the historical normative text of Judaism that one can find the origins and sustainability of Israeli democracy. The other answer, which sounds a little bit more scholarly and more reasonable, is that the first settlers, Olim, immigrants to Palestine, Eretz Israel, came from Europe, and that they brought with them the European traditions of liberal democracy, even social democracy, and therefore, just as the original settlers in North America brought with them the English parliamentary or self-governing tradition, which then were established in the New England townships and eventually in the American Constitution in one way or another, just like that, the immigrants who came from Europe brought with them the European tradition of the Enlightenment, liberalism, and democracy. This sounds plausible, but does not really answer the question, because most of the immigrants who came from Europe, and most of the immigrants pre-1948 came from Europe, 90% of them came from Europe, did not come from Britain or France or Norway. They came from countries which were not democratic. One of the reasons that Jews emigrated from those countries was precisely because those countries were oppressive. They came either from Tsarist Russia or later from Bolshevik Communist Russia. They came from Poland or Hungary or Romania between the two world wars, which were authoritarian semi-fascist dictatorships. And then, of course, they came from Nazi Germany or countries like Austria or Czechoslovakia occupied by Nazi Germany. So if those people, the founding fathers and mothers of Israel, would have brought with them the traditions of their countries of origin, they would have brought authoritarian, one-party, communist or semi-fascist traditions. The reason that Israeli democracy did develop has to do with history, but in a different way. Jews did not have political power in the meaning of sovereignty and political power with armies and the military and total self-government. But when you look at the way in which Jewish communities existed in Europe, but also in the Middle East, but mainly in Europe, one had again to realize that until the Holocaust, almost 85% of the Jewish population in the world were living in European countries, that Jewish communities in Europe, but as I said, also in the Middle East, had centuries of experience of self-government. The Jewish community, the Jewish Kehillah, or the Jewish Kahal, were really political entities in a very minor but meaningful way. Judaism survived not because of texts, but because of historical and social context. If Jewish people settled anywhere, in Spain under Muslim or Christian rule, in France, later in Germany and in Eastern Europe, and of course also in the Middle East, if Jews settled anywhere and they wanted to have a place of prayer, they wanted to have a place where the children would learn the historical norms of Judaism. They wanted to create systems of social responsibility. The only way they could do it, because they did not have a state, they did not have political power, the only way to do it was to do it by voluntary elective systems. A Jewish community could be established if there were sufficient number of Jewish people who congregated together, decided to set up a community, set up their own rules, because there were no universal rules that could be adopted from above. And they elected some of the members as chairmen or secretaries or treasurers. They appointed learned people to teach them the norms of Judaism, rabbis. And the system was based not on rabbinical authority, but was based on the ability of people to elect their own leaders. And if you look at the histories of Jewish communities all over the world, each Jewish community was a little bit of a city-state, a polis, if you wish, but without sovereignty. There were elections. And if you look at the histories of the various Jewish communities, you will find that some were more egalitarian and some were less egalitarian. Obviously, women did not have a vote in the community. But there were a lot of issues that had to be decided, and they could be decided only by the people themselves in every community, because the holy books didn't have answers to them. Who is entitled to vote? Everybody, or everybody above the age of 13, or perhaps only those who pay taxes. No representation without taxation, if I may reverse the American slogan. Could people be elected again and again, or would there be time limits? And you will find that some communities were more egalitarian. They allowed everybody to vote, every male member to vote. Other communities were less egalitarian and decided that only those who pay taxes. Some were more oligarchic and allowed members of the same family to be elected again and again, and some were less oligarchic and more egalitarian and put limits on members of any family that could be elected at any given time to the community leadership. So over centuries, Jewish people did not have a state, but they were adept at politics. If you read the way in which those communities worked, you will find the normal ways of elective, contentious democracies. You will find political fights. You will find cliques. You will find all the nice and nasty aspects of democratic politics. You will find situations in which people seceded from a community because they didn't like the leaders or they didn't like the rabbi, and they moved across the street or across the hill and set up a different community. The fact was that when you came to the 19th century, you find Jewish people knowing how to do some very basic things: how to elect, how to create coalitions, how to fight opposition, and to create a basic consensus of voluntary taxation, because there was no state that could individually impose itself on those members of the community. those communities were also the representatives, or the leadership of those communities were also the representatives of the Jewish community vis-a-vis the powers that be, the kings, the dukes, the emperors, the sultans, whatever it was. In some countries, especially in the area which was a major area of Jewish settlement in Europe, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, basically Poland historically, you had also regional councils. Since the end of the Middle Ages, the Jewish communities in Poland, which was at that time the largest Jewish community in the world, elected regional councils, Vad Arba Aratzot, the Council of the Four Lands. The Four Lands were basically the four provinces of the Polish community, of the Polish kingdom. And this Vad Arba Aratzot met once a year in Lublin at the fair, because Jewish people were basically active in business, and discussed issues which today would be the issues of political parliaments without having sovereignty. They decided, for example, very early on in the 17th century, that every young male, again, only male, every young male Jewish person should have a number of years of studying in a cheder, in a school, so that he will be able to read the prayer books. They decided on voluntary taxation. Some of it, again, was more egalitarian, some of it more hierarchical. And they decided also on solidarity. When one community was devastated, either by natural forces or by pogroms or by wars, you could see how the other communities set up emergency funds to help those refugees or to help them re-establish their community. So you had an experience of political activity. And when the Zionist movement was established in 1897, at the first Zionist Congress, the people who established the first Zionist Congress by invitation realized that the next thing they have to do is to create elections and to hold elections, which they did. And when the first settlers, immigrants, came to Eretz Israel at the end of the 19th century, they established the first agricultural colonies, moshavot, eventually a garden suburb called Tel Aviv near Jaffa. They knew how to do those things, and there was no state to do it for them because the state was not in their hand. It was in the hands of either Christian or Muslim rulers. But they knew, and they knew how to decide those issues. They elected some members as the secretaries of the first kibbutz or the secretaries of the first semi-municipal community committee of Tel Aviv. They knew how to allocate taxes, and they knew also how to be able to collect those taxes through voluntary means, which sometimes meant a lot of social pressure without having state power. So very early on, the Jewish community in Palestine, first under Ottoman rules and later under British mandate since the 1920s, established the local basis of self-government. And as early as 1920s, there were elections for the first community, the first council of the Jewish community of Eretz Israel, אספת הנבחרים לכנסת ישראל בארץ ישראל. And you will be amused. At that time, there were less than 100,000 Jews in Palestine, and not all of them were adults. So we're talking about a few tens of thousands of people. In the first election to the first representative council of Palestinian Jews, Jews of Eretz Israel, there were 22 political parties. Today, with 9 million people, we have fewer. So there is a tradition of elective government, of pluralism, of very contentious politics, sometimes pretty nasty, and a system which calls for coalitions. Because never in the history of Palestinian Jewry and later in the history of Israel did any political party get a majority. There were pluralities, but never majorities. And therefore, the largest party or parties, initially it usually was the Labour Party or Labour parties. In the last decades, it's much more the right-wing Likud, needed coalitions. So you have to know the art of coalition building. So you have a tradition which is very strong. And on 14th or 15th of May 1948, the Jewish community in the new established Medinat Israel, State of Israel, didn't have to invent the political system. The political system was a continuation of the autonomous, non-independent, non-sovereign Jewish community of Palestine. And thus, David Ben-Gurion, who was the chairman of the Jewish Agency for Palestine, became the first provisional prime minister of Israel. The heads of the political department or the treasury department or the agricultural department of the Jewish community of Palestine became the first ministers in a provisional government. And the second thing, after declaring independence and then defending the country, was to set up elections. And the elections took place within a few months, and the political parties already existed. There were a number of labor parties, there were a number of liberal bourgeois parties, there were a number of right-wing political parties. So you have here a tradition in which Israeli democracy was not an outcome of a constitutional assembly which just looked at British or French models, but it grew organically from the local grassroots level and the political behavior of Jews in the diaspora. And here is, of course, a paradox. Zionism, on one hand, was a rejection of diaspora lives. On the other hand, and most of it was secular, but on the other hand, it brought with it the traditions, the social real tradition, not based on text, but on social behavior, which is something that is relevant also to looking at processes of democratization in the last decades, be it in Central Eastern Europe or in the Arab world, where you have traditions of elective representative government on the local level, with people behaving in a way in which representation and elections are legitimate. It is relatively possible to move to a fully fledged democratic liberal system, where those traditions do not exist, like in Russia, with the Tsarist and Soviet tradition, or in Arab societies, where you have either dynastic or tribal or other traditions, or military dictatorship, very deeply anchored in the political history of those countries. It is very difficult to move. So if in the United States people pride themselves, and rightly so, on the New England township, looking back to the self-government tradition of England or Britain, in our case, our New England townships are the Jewish kehilot, the Jewish historical traditions, which taught Jewish people how to live, not in agreement, sometimes in very contentious ways, but basically in a system which drew its legitimacy from elections and from the ability to elect people and to throw them out of office. The history books and the memoirs of the various Jewish communities tell you of political fights which are perhaps minuscule, but they are really a prototype of what it means to have a political representative elective system. So Israel started with very good traditions, deeply anchored, and therefore it was possible to move towards a democratic system without really having a constitution, which is perhaps a problem, but you did not have a constitution because you had a context, because you had a tradition of elective representative government. And the great achievement was the ability of the small Jewish community in the State of Israel to integrate slowly and not always very successfully the newcomers coming mainly from Europe, survivors of Holocaust, and from Arab countries. And this is not really the time to go into the details, but you can again see how the newcomers, and this is especially the case of Middle Eastern newcomers, Mizrahim or Sephardim, whatever you want to call them, in how they were able to integrate slowly into the political system, just as in the United States, the integration of new immigrants, be they Irish or Italian or Jewish, didn't really start at the top. Only in 1960 did you have the first American president who wasn't a Protestant. But for decades in the United States, Irish people, Italians, Jews moved to the local level, to the municipal level, and then to the state level. And the same happened in Israel since the 1960s. You could see how local government was much more responsive to the ability to integrate new immigrants, and from the local level, municipal level, mayors, heads of council, eventually you had also people who were able to contest parliamentary elections, and today the Israeli parliament is as representative as necessary of the various groups within Israeli society, both within the Jewish community as well as within the Arab community. Now, this is a history. As was mentioned both by Dov and by David, there are at the moment challenges to Israeli society. And some of those challenges are part of the general challenge to democratic institutions and perhaps even to democratic legitimacy in the democratic world. And some of those challenges in Israel are very, very similar. And I want to go through some of them before speaking about the present situation. Again, I want to say it in parentheses. It is very easy to personalize it. It's very easy to criticize a prime minister like Netanyahu, who has been in power for 10 years, and I'm among his critics. But this goes beyond personalities. It has to do with political structures. The historical political parties of Western democracies in Britain, in France, in the United States, recently we see it even in Germany, where many people thought that Germany would be immune to challenges from populist, right-wing, racist groups. We see the historical parties have been weakened. In a country like France, the historical parties, the socialists on the left and the basically Catholic but conservative parties on the right have been really wiped out. In Britain, we have seen something similar happening to the political parties. The United States is a little bit more complicated, but one of the two major parties has lost the Republican Party has lost its character and became really an appendix to one person. It may change, but this is really the fact. You do not have two political parties representing two various ideologies. You have one populist, personalist party in the United States. The same happened in Israel. The traditional parties, especially the Labour Party, has been weakened. And this has also to do with a universal phenomenon. The center-left parties, the social democratic parties, the Labour parties, in a different way, the Democratic Party in the United States, have been weakened in the last decades. They have become highly bureaucratized and sometimes lost touch with their constituencies. The center-left parties in Western democracies and in Israel were also coalitions between intellectuals on one hand, liberal intellectuals, and working-class people who were interested in those parties, not necessarily for ideological reasons, but because those parties gave answers to their economic and social needs. Trade unions, minimum wages, the welfare state. The center-left parties in practically all Western democracies and in Israel have lost touch with this constituency or constituencies. And if you look at what were the agendas for many of the center-left parties in Western democracy, including Israel, they move from universal norms of social justice, on one hand, to identity politics, and also to trying to address issues that had to be addressed, but they were addressed at the cost of neglecting the historical constituencies. Center-left parties, and again, I'm not criticizing, but there was a price for it, have been focusing in the last decades on issues like women's rights, immigrants, waste, gay and lesbian rights. All of them justifiably needed to be addressed, but this was done with sometimes neglecting the historical constituencies, which were working class and lower middle class. As a consequence of that, many of the weaker groups of societies, which were also hit by the consequences of globalization, unemployment, deindustrialization, the moving of industries to third world countries, felt alienated from the political parties, especially the center-left parties, which had historically defended their interests. And they were looking for populist, charismatic leaders and parties that were defending them against, among other things, immigrants, minorities. And one of the major failures of center-left parties, and they have paid a very high price for it, including in Israel, was that they lost support of their natural historical constituency. This is one issue which is universal and had a special impact also in Israel. Another aspect of this development is specifically Israeli, and it has to do with changes in Israeli society since 1967, since the Six-Day War, and the fact that Israel, because of the war, came to be in control of the lives of millions of Palestinians in the occupied territories, and found it not very easy to find solutions how to address those issues. And this had to do with a shift in Israel of the term left wing and right wing. If you would have come to Israel in the 1960s and would have tried to identify left wing parties or right wing parties, the identification of left and right would be more or less similar to the identification of those parties in European or North American parties. If you were a person of the left, you supported strong social state intervention or regulation of the economy. You were more or less for egalitarian wage systems. You supported the welfare state in terms of education, in terms of health, and in terms of social services. And if you were a person of the right, you believe in a free market and in a more naturalistic approach to issues of state and nation. So the Israeli divide of left and right was parallel to the divide in the West. Since the focusing on Israeli-Palestinian relations since 1967, the terms left and right in Israel received a slight nuance and change. Left in Israel today is identified with groups who support self-determination for the Palestinians, oppose settlement in the occupied territories, and call for a two-state solution, an end of Israeli occupation. Right wing in Israel today means that you support settlement in the West Bank, support in one way or another Israeli control on the West Bank, if not outright annexation, and to oppose a two-state solution and oppose an independent Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. In other words, the terms left and right moved from being signifiers of social and economic divide and became signifiers of issues of national identity. This greatly weakened the Israeli left, because again, a paradox, historically until the 1970s, the Israeli left, the Labour Party, people like Ben-Gurion, Moshe Sharet, Golda Meir, were identified with nationalism, with the victory in wars, with the army. Today, the left is identified with being pro-Arab and not patriotic enough. This is an outcome of the Six-Day War, and it changed the political discourse of the country. There is also another aspect that has to do with the development in Israel, and has to do with demographic change. Half of the Israeli Jewish population comes today from a very different background from the background of the initial fathers and mothers of the country. Many of the people who come from the former Soviet Union, and I'm saying it carefully, and I'm saying many, and I shouldn't generalize, 1 million Israeli Jews who came from the former Soviet Union brought with them traditions of believing in a strong state, which is the Russian tradition. And for them, issues of human rights, minority rights, are not at the center of their focus. Many, and I don't want to name names, but many of the Jewish, very heroic dissidents in the Soviet Union who fought for rights for themselves as Jews and as members of the minority in Russia are not that enthusiastic about the rights of Arab or Palestinian minorities in Israel. As one former Russian immigrant told me, he said, I don't want to live under Putin, but I want my leader to be like Putin. Now, again, this is a generalization. Not all of the people coming from the former Soviet Union believe in a strong state, but a very large majority of them do believe in a strong state. On the other side, many people coming from Arab countries, and again, I'm generalizing, but one has to admit that there is here an issue, come with memories of oppression by Arab societies in countries like Iraq or Morocco or Yemen. And therefore, for them, the Palestinians are the brothers or the cousins of their historical oppressors. Again, as one immigrant from Morocco once told me, if Israel would be surrounded by 19 or 23 Ukrainian countries, many Jews coming from Ukraine would not be very enthusiastic about the right of self-determination of the Ukrainians. Again, I'm not talking in terms of total numbers, but the fact is that among immigrants coming with those traditions, there is a larger tendency to see, to support leaders and parties who are more ethnocentric and less universalistic. So there have been changes in Israeli societies, demographic societies, which when coupled with the other changes, the weakening of the welfare state, the weakening universally of let's say, the large historical parties of the left or the right, this have created a change. To this, one had also to add the fact that many Israelis who on one hand oppose annexation of the West Bank and oppose more Jewish settlements in the West Bank. In other words, many Israelis who are not supporters of the Likud are still not totally sure that the Palestinians are accepting Israel as a Jewish nation state. One of the great achievements of President Sadat when he came in 1977 to Jerusalem and addressed the Knesset is something which many Israelis today forget. On one hand, when Sadat made his historical speech in the Knesset, his political demands were 100% hawkish from the Arab point of view. He called for a total Israeli withdrawal from eastern Jerusalem, from the Golan Heights, from the West Bank, from Gaza, from Sinai, from the Gulf of Aqaba. In territorial terms, Sadat expressed 100% support for the historical Arab position. Nothing beyond the 1967 lines. But most Israelis who listen to him listen also to the other message. And the message, which was so important and revolutionary, was when Sadat said to the Israeli Knesset, for 30 years, we did not accept you. I am here to tell you that we accept you. This was a game changer. It wasn't couched in diplomatic mumbo jumbo. It was simple language. We accept you. We have not heard until now a similar statement from any Palestinian leader, neither Arafat and nor Abu Mazen, who is obviously more careful and more moderate. Nothing like this, which explains why many Israelis who may not support the Likud or may not support Netanyahu still have problems being convinced that the Palestinians are accepting the existence of Israel as a Jewish state in a world, in a region which is not, which is basically Muslim and Arab. To this, one can also add that more than 10 years of Likud and Netanyahu rule have created what usually is the case of a party or a leader being in power for a very long time. I'm saying it as a Labour supporter. We have seen similar things in the last years of Labour Party and Ben-Gurion's rule. There is a lot of sense in time limits, and I hope that we're going to have some legislation about time limits. When people stay in power for too long, be it political parties, be it individual leaders, something bad is happening to their perception of themselves and their relationship to power. And this applies also today to the people in government. They have been in power, Netanyahu has been in power for a very long time. And whether you agree or disagree with his policies, and I disagree, but I'm saying it from a different perspective, being too long in power is a problem. For this reason, time limits, as you now have them in the United States, are very, very important, have been going to have them. But basically, despite all of this, I am realistic and optimistic. The Israeli political system is, the Israeli democratic system is resilient. It is being challenged. Some of the language, and is being exacerbated by the social media, which calls for aggressive language and makes aggressive language much more popular and acceptable than before. Before the social media, you could use vile language when you were talking among your friends. Now you just do it on your Twitter and Facebook account, and who knows, 90 million people may be listening to you. So there is a cost to the democratization of the political discourse, which is obviously one of the great achievements of the social media, but there is also a cost here. Despite all of this, the Israeli system is resilient. And it is resilient not because democracy or liberalism or tolerance are ingrained in the Jewish people, but they are ingrained in their political behavior, in the factual, actual way in which people behave. Some of the tumultuous nature and anarchic nature of Israeli politics is perhaps the greatest guarantee for the resilience of the system. It is being challenged. The courts are being challenged. But I basically see no serious danger to the processes of democratization of Israel. Israel today, with regard to its Arab minority, with regard to pluralism regarding Middle Eastern immigrants and their culture, with a much more open mind to varieties of personal or sexual experiences, is today much more liberal and much more open than it was 20 or 30 years ago, when this was still a very closely knit community of people who were more or less thinking in the same way, despite the fact that there were more than one Liberal Party or more than one Labour Party. The paradox of Israeli society is something which very few societies have: pluralism within solidarity. When it comes down to existential issues, Israeli Jewish society is based on solidarity. When it comes to the question, how do you deal with this solidarity, every Israeli is king, and therefore you have a republic. I think this is a very, very important mainstay of Israeli society. And despite the fact that one has to be on one's guard, and there are changes in Israeli society, not always very welcome, I am optimistic about the ability of the system to maintain itself. If I may just end with a parallel to the United States, I cannot imagine something like last Wednesday happening in Israel. Other things, yes, but not this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Avineri, for that very sweeping synthesis and for the measure of optimism, which I think we all are in desperate need of in these times. We have a number of questions, and I'd like to maybe begin with one of my own. As you know, there are many different varieties of democracy. There is liberal democracy, there's Republican democracy, there's representative democracy, there's, as we see today, majoritarian democracy. What form of democracy do you see having emerged out of the Kehillah Forum? And here you tap into that tradition of modern thinkers and scholars who saw in the Kehillah the font of not just political sagacity, but also a democratic tradition. The name Daniel Alazar comes to mind, Yitzhak Ber and his famous article in Sion. But it's a very different democracy than Western liberal democracy, which celebrates and venerates the rights of the individual. That's not what you're talking about. So what is can you describe or even name that democratic tradition that emerges out of the Kehillah that you feel was brought over? And I would just add to that, it seems to me, and you know this material extraordinarily well, there is not an exceptionally robust discourse about democracy in early Zionist thought, democracy per se. There's discussions about egalitarianism, socialism, but democracy per se, we see it ironically enough, or maybe not so ironically, in revisionists, in Jabotinsky. We see debates amongst religious Zionists like Rav Herzog about accommodating a theocratic principle to a modern democratic order. So what was imported from the Kehillah, and what was the discussion around democracy in early Zionism that was then received into the newly created state of Israel? How would you describe it? Not liberal democracy in the modern Western sense.
I'm not very good at definitions, because definitions leave somebody outside the pale. I agree with you, there wasn't much discussion about democracy because there was institutional democracy. But let me give you one example, or two examples. The system of elections in the Jewish community in Palestine from the 1920s, which was later adopted by Israeli society, was proportional representation, which meant that the whole country or the whole community is one district, and if you get 5% of the vote, you get 5% of members of parliament or whatever. And the reason for this was because they wanted to avoid majoritarian systems like the British or the American system. They wanted to be inclusive. If you wanted in Jewish Palestine and later in the state of Israel to have the religious community, which at that time was very small, between 5 and 7%, you didn't want them to be outside of the community, to be like a two-way car, the ultra-Orthodox who didn't accept the Jewish community. You wanted to have them included. You needed to have proportional representation. Ben-Gurion at one point tried to move from a proportional system to a constituency system, and he was opposed by many in his own party, including myself. I was at that time a young member of the Labour Party, because we opposed Ben-Gurion, who at that time had something like 40%, his party had 40% of the vote, and he wanted with 40% of the vote to have 80% of members of the Knesset, and we found this is not democratic. So the insistence of proportional representation, which was never seriously challenged, meant that you had an anchor in the system. The same applied to the issue of giving the right of vote in 1948, 49, to those Arabs who did not leave or were not expelled from Israel. And at that time, there were less than 10% of the population. Nobody in 1948 ever imagined that they will be excluded. You could have imagined that people would have said, well, so long as there is a war, so long as there is no peace, so long as there is no acceptance, the Israeli Arabs, those who remain, will not be expelled, but they don't have a right to vote. Nobody ever raised it. It was very clear that in the middle of the war against all Arab countries, Israeli Arabs were voting. We know what the United States did with people of Japanese origin during World War II. So you are right that there was very little discussion. One of the reasons is that because there was a reality of what can be called communitarian democracy, that you don't want to exclude a group. And let me give you another example. We have a very uneasy, and to many of us on the secular side, sometimes unpleasant, system of compromise called the status quo between the secular and religious groups in the country. This was established in the 1920s after a lengthy debate, which perhaps does not find its, you don't find its traces in the history books. Well, you find its traces in the history books, but not in the consciousness of people today. At that time, there was a question whether women should be given rights to vote. And this was 1920s, when this wasn't really yet universal. I mean, France didn't give women the vote until World War II, or Switzerland until the 1990s. So in the 1920s, this was a serious issue, among other things, because in the Zionist movement, as a voluntary movement, of course, women had the right to vote. And the religious groups in Eretz Israel were against giving the right to vote to women. And this was one of the reasons which threatened to see most of the religious groups not joining the Jewish community organization, Asefat HaNibcharim. And at the end, with a lot of horse trading, if you may say so, a compromise was found. Yes, women will be given the right to vote. In return for this, the secular Jewish community of Palestine accepted that kashrut and the observance of the Jewish holidays will be preserved and observed in the public institutions of the Jewish community. And it's very interesting, if you look into the debate within the Jewish religious community, to give the right to vote to women for religious Jews is against the issue. I mean, only men count from minyan, etc., and they don't vote. They never voted in Jewish communities. The argument showed that some people are smart. One of the arguments was the following: let us look at a religious family. A religious family, the husband and the wife, both of them will vote for religious parties, because this is what a religious family is. You cannot imagine a religious party in which the husband is religious and the wife is not, or vice versa. In what is called secular family, you can find situations in which the husband is secular or atheistic, but the woman still lights candles on Shabbat or keeps some sort of kashrut out of sentiment to her parents, etc. So in those families, some of the people, some of the women may vote for the religious parties. So in the net result, if women get the vote, this religious person said, we are going to be the ones who will get more votes than the secular people, because we can get some votes from the secular families, no secular party will get votes from religious families. Now you had a real debate. It was in the Hebrew press, it was in all kinds of tracts written on the right and the left. So the debate was there. Again, as I said, in the 1930s, Jabotinsky and his people, after they lost an election in the 1930s to the left wing, they left the Zionist organization and did not accept a majority rule. After 1948, slowly, they came back and participated in the first election. And let me remind you, after something which was almost an insurrection during the Altalena affair in June of 1948, 5 months later, Menachem Begin, who in a way was involved in this semi-insurrection, was elected as member of the Knesset for Cherut, as at that time was called the Likud party. So I agree, there was less debate, but more reality. And maybe this is a footnote. Sometimes when issues are debated, it means that the reality is different. When the reality is okay, and the reality of communitarian democracy, that you do not want to exclude any community, be it secular, religious, Arab, from the body politic, you don't need to have too much debate.
Well, I'm glad I was able to extract a definition from you, notwithstanding your opening profession of distaste for definitions. But I think you're absolutely right that this is a communitarian form of democracy. But I think one of the key questions is how inclusive is it? And I want to maybe pursue that line of questioning by referring to some of the questions that have been raised, which take up one set of questions takes up your reading of traditional Jewish religious sources. So one questioner asked whether we should dismiss the biblical background so quickly. Is there not a division of power between prophets and kings, a division of spheres, Keter Malchut, Keter Nevuah? And does that not generate a kind of accountability that made its way into diaspora Jewish political behavior, into the Kahal or the Kehillah? So one questioner asked about the biblical roots, and is there not a democratic tradition that one can identify there? In related fashion, a questioner asks about sort of the tradition of majority rule in the rabbinic Beit Midrash and the medieval commentarial tradition with figures like Yitzhak Abravanel, who rejected monarchy and lauded Venetian representative government. So I guess this is an invitation for you to reflect again, not just on the actual operation of the Kehillah and the democracy, the communitarian democracy you find within, but the actual religious sources of the tradition. And do they not generate some possibilities for democratic opening?
Okay, let me first start with the Jewish community. The Jewish community, the Kehillah, with the institutions of elections, grew out of the needs of Jews, real Jews living in real conditions. They didn't open the books. They had to answer a question, how are we going to have a synagogue? The only way is by voting for voluntary taxes, for voting for leaders to implement them. They didn't look at taxes, and they couldn't find anything. I am a great admirer of the prophetic tradition, but the prophetic tradition is not institutionalized. To speak truth to power, as Edward Said, not exactly a biblical prophet, but as Edward Said said, is a very great Jewish tradition. But speaking truth to power is perhaps the role of intellectuals. This is the dissenting intellectual. But the prophecies were not, the prophets were not institutionalized. They didn't have the kind of rule which later on the Catholic Church ascribed to itself, being a limiting force against kingly, royal, or imperial power. So those traditions were also not existing in the Jewish community. I'm not aware of any prophet in any community being in either in Krakow or Casablanca. This is in the text, yes, and we know that those people, some of them were admired and some of them were, in a way, even embraced by royalty, and some were persecuted by royalty. This is the prophetic tradition, is the tradition of the descending intellectual, not of the political institutional system in which you elect people and you have majorities and majorities. Now, you can always quote Acher Rabim Lehatot, etc., but the Mishnah is not based on a situation in which rabbis in Beit Midrash were descending and then they took a vote. You have a quote Acher Rabim Lehatot, but this is not the way. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi and later others decided what came in and did not come in, and they had the decision of being Rosh HaKehillah, Rosh HaYeshiva in Shua or Pompedita, or before that in the Galilee. This was not an institutional system in which you have regular elections and you can vote somebody out. Nobody could vote out Hillel Hazaken or Rabbi Gamliel or Rabbi Yehuda. So I understand why religious people are looking for legitimacy, for democratic norms in the Bible. That's fine. This is not historical evidence. This is the attempt to combine basically a religious system, which is based not on human decision, but on divine ordinance, to combine it with democratic institutions. Bruchim habayim la'olam hamoderni. I'm very glad that they are looking for legitimacy for democracy. But those are not the historical sources of the institutional democracies in Israel or in the Jewish communities.
Thank you. Okay. A number of questioners asked about the immigrants that came to the country, to Israel, whom you made special reference to, those who came from the former Soviet Union or from Arab and Muslim countries, Iran as well. And one questioner asked whether emigres from fascist countries, presumably from the former Soviet bloc, did not come to Israel with a horror of the authoritarian regimes from which they came. And here, I guess I would add to that question, the Jews who brought that institutional democracy that you spoke of in the first waves of Zionist Aliyah also came from autocratic repressive systems. What's the difference between those who came in the early 20th century and those who came in the late 20th century? Just to go back to the question here, why would one not expect them to bring an abhorrence for the dictatorial autocratism of a communist regime?
This is a very interesting and complex question, but let's go back to the 1920s. In the 1920s, people in Central Eastern Europe, Jewish people, who were uncomfortable with their situation, basically had three choices: emigrate to the United States, join the Communist Party to overthrow the system, or come to Palestine, or stay where they are. There was a way of integrating into the system through being the spearhead of the Communist Party. I mean, the reason why so many Jews and other minorities, but specifically Jews, were so central in the Communist Party in its first years in Russia and later also in countries like Poland, Hungary, Romania, is not because Jews have a tendency to be communists, this is nonsense, but because they felt oppressed by the system and viewed the Communist Party, because of its universal ideas, as a way towards full equal human rights. Eventually, situation became different, but this is why they joined the Communist Party, not because they read Karl Marx or the Communist Manifesto, mainly. This is not an option that remained for Jews after 50 or 60 years of the Soviet Union. They had no way of joining the communist system because the communist system was a corrupt authoritarian system. And again, they were dissidents, many of them, but they came, as I quoted this one person who said, I don't want to live under Putin, but I want to live under with my leader to be a strong leader. They came with a tradition of strong leaders. This is not what Jews had in mind in 1920s when they joined the Communist Party and they ended up with Lenin and Stalin. This is what they ended up, but this is not why they joined the party. So after 50 or 60 years of authoritarian system, many of them, and I'm saying many of them, not all of them, are more open to strong parties and not for universal ideas of human rights, especially if the human rights are claimed for people who are enemies of the Jewish people, like the Arabs or the Palestinians. The situation is a totally different one.
Okay, I want to ask the other side of that coin, question about the other side of the coin, referring to Mizrahim. A question arises, are attitudes of young Mizrahi Jews any different from their parents in terms of antagonism to Palestinians? Does the reclaiming of the Arab culture of the parents and grandparents extend to politics? So I guess this is a question about generational differences in various immigrant groups that you have argued stand outside that institutional democratic tradition.
There is no uniform answer to that. And I think the answer eventually has to be seen in what is called, I don't like the term, intermarriage between European or Mizrahi Jews. More than 30% of Jewish marriages in Israel are now intermarriages in this sense. So the generational change is very, very deep, and it will eventually somehow disappear. There is among some of the second generation Mizrahim, especially among some intellectual group, a small group, very significant academically, who want to retrace or maintain the Arab cultural traditions. But this is not a major trend among Mizrahi Jews. And again, generational changes are important. And if one can put it in a very delicate way, we're dealing here not with political issues, but with cultural issues. The cultural issues are very different. If you come with memories of being persecuted by Nazi Germans, or if you come to Israel and being persecuted, or you or your parents were persecuted by Arabs in Morocco or Yemen or Iraq. So this is an issue which is one of the major issues. It has also to do, and the educational system is very important, that the educational system today makes it possible to integrate into the highest levels of the Israeli economy, government, the Knesset, the army, of a lot of people of Middle Eastern background, something that 40 or 50 years wasn't there. I just wanted to suggest that there is an issue there that has to be dealt very, very carefully. As I said, I'm not generalizing, but it is something that has to be addressed, that there are different pre-political attitudes to many of the immigrants coming from countries which are not democratic.
So I wonder, just before I ask the final question from our questioners, if you could address the recent interview and larger body of work of Israeli sociologist Nissim Mizrahi, who suggested that the problem is not that Mizrahim have not acculturated sufficiently into the communitarian democratic tradition of Israel, but that there's a liberal bias in sort of setting expectations for the way Mizrahim should behave. And we're going to fail to understand again and again if we assume that the ideal is sort of the liberal Western, liberal democratic view of things. We're sort of missing what actually is going on. And he would say generation after generation. It's not as if there's any mitigation, as it were, as we move from the immigrant generation to the generation of the children or grandchildren. They're not becoming more liberal, it seems, with the exception of a small number of academics. So do we bring our own liberal Western bias to our to an understanding of Mizrahim, and for that matter, perhaps to Palestinians as well?
I don't want to argue with Nissim Mizrahi, but in a way, some aspect of what he is saying sustains what I'm saying, that some of the Oriental tradition is not liberal. Yes, if we want to give up the liberal tradition, because the liberal tradition is Western, and we should accept illiberal traditions under the guise of Mizrahi traditions, well, this is a very serious challenge to liberal democracy.
Okay, final set of questions. There are many, many more that we could ask, and I'd love to sit here in conversation with you for another hour, but time is running short. Deal with the future and the future political arrangement of the State of Israel. So one questioner asks whether or not there has not, in fact, been a de facto annexation of the West Bank, which would call into question Israel's self-definition as democratic. Another asks, in terms of thinking of future political arrangements, would you imagine a possible one-state solution, a binational state of Arab Jews living together, envisaged by many progressive minds, possibly more democratic or less democratic than the status quo? So one question revolves around the issue of annexation and what that does to democracy, and the other asks about the one-state idea, more democratic, less democratic.
I don't think that annexation is a real option, and I don't think it's going to happen. And certainly the fact that we rule outside of Israel millions of Palestinians is something which is non-democratic. If you want to call it colonial or colonialist, I don't just use those terms. Well, Britain and France were democracies when they had empires. And one, in the case of France, it was even Algeria. So the situation is not India far away. Algeria was integrated into France, but without equal rights to the Muslim Arab population. So yes, the very fact that Israel continues rule, and not within Israel, but as an occupied military area in the West Bank in a different way in Gaza, is certainly a challenge to Israeli democracy. It has not yet totally undermined the fact that Israel, within its sovereign borders, is a multi-party country with 20% of its population being Arab. The one-state solution is something which is a nightmare. First of all, when you look at the last few years, all multinational states have been broken up, sometimes peacefully and sometimes violently. The Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because in multinational countries like this, every issue becomes a dividing issue, and politics is much more polarized and much more ethnocentric because issues like education, language, how to call a certain city, how to call a certain area. Do you use the Serb term or the Croat term? Do you use the Hungarian term or the Slovak term? Become a divide. Let me also add something else. No Arab society until now has been able to create a democratic society. And it has to do with the preponderance of family, clan, regional, tribal elements in all Arab societies. Israel is challenged from within its own system. We discussed some of them. Bringing in 4 million Palestinian Arabs who don't have elections in their own country. I mean, the Palestinian Authority, and I don't want to criticize them, it's their business, is an authority that should have been elected, should have held elections many, many years ago. It had one election, and that's it. And I don't think it's going to have elections soon. So to bring in a society which within its own system is unable to create majority-minority rules will be toxic. I mean, the Palestinian society, which isn't able to create a basic consensus between the Fatah and the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza, they cannot create a consensus within an Arab-Palestinian society. To bring in 4 million people into Israeli society, and let me just be very nasty about it. What days will we celebrate? Whom will we celebrate in this one society? Theodor Herzl or the Mufti of Jerusalem? The Haganah or Fatah terrorists? Or will we call them terrorists or freedom fighter? Or have a debate about that? In a situation in which you have, and this is a universal experience, which I think we should integrate. In a situation in which you have two contending claims to legitimacy, the only way out of the solution is to give each of those communities a place in the sun. Yugoslavia is a bad and good example. So long as Yugoslavia existed, under Tito and after Tito, every political issue in Yugoslavia was an incipient civil war, mainly between Serbs and Croats. Today, Serbia and Croatia, after a terrible war, after ethnic cleansing, after terrible things that happened on both sides, paradoxically, Serbia and Croatia are allies in a European orientation and are helping each other to enter the European Union. They have a clear border. We have to have between us and the Palestinians a clear border. We in Israel will celebrate the 29th of November as a great achievement for Jewish legitimacy. For the Palestinians, this may be the beginning of their Nakba, of their catastrophe. We will view the war of 1948, we, the Jews, as a war of independence and a war of survival. The Palestinians will view it differently. And I wouldn't say I respect it, but this is their view. Nationalism is about self-determination. We cannot determine what the Palestinians should think. They cannot determine, and they shouldn't determine what we should think. We should have each their own place in the sun. And then, as Serbia and Croatia, we can work together. I hope we can work together. How will this one state be called? Will it be called Israel, or will it be called Palestine? I mean, people who talk about a one-state solution have no idea what they're talking about. They should look at the experience of multinational states which were established under democratic or communist ideologies and say why all of them failed. The only way is about allowing individual communities to have their place in the sun. We have our place in the sun. I hope soon the Palestinians will have their place in the sun, and we should help them. But it is their place, and this is our place.
Well, there are many more questions to raise and discuss, but alas, we have run out of time. On that very emphatic final note, I would like to thank you, Professor Shlomo Avineri, for a most illuminating, learned, and sweeping discussion of democracy in Israel, past, present, and future. We're very grateful that you made time out of your schedule. And I'd just like to remind the audience that there will be 2 subsequent lectures in this series by Professor Eve Luz of the Hebrew University and Professor Yuli Tamir. So pay attention to the announcements from the Nazarian Center, and please stay well and healthy. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.